President Trump is facing new criticism for retweeting a video that shows someone shouting "white power." And lawmakers hear testimony on the forceful removal of peaceful protesters near the White House earlier this month. Natalie Brand reports.
Even before the officers charged.
At a House hearing, a demonstrator and a journalist described the scene on June 1st when federal officers aggressively cleared peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square near the White House.
They were pushing and running towards us with their shields, and people started to panic. A world of confusion ensued. I could not really understand what was going on.
News cameras caught video of Australian journalists forcibly pushed out.
Covering protests does carry unavoidable risks, but the media's role is essential.
After officers cleared the area that evening ahead of the designated curfew, the president walked over to nearby St. John's Church, where he held up a Bible.
Nowhere does the Bible condone the use of violence against the innocent.
Committee Republicans turned the attention to some violent actions during earlier protests.
I think the court would recognize that there were security issues that were valid for the administration. I think the court would likely say that the original order was lawful.
The hearing on Capitol Hill comes as President Trump is facing new criticism over videos he's retweeted about ongoing protests nationwide. Monday, the president retweeted news footage of a St. Louis, Missouri couple pointing a weapon at peaceful protesters marching by. White power! Sunday, President Trump also retweeted this video where a Trump supporter at a Florida retirement community shouted "white power."
We did not hear that particular phrase when he tweeted out the video.
The White House press secretary emphasized the president's strong stance on law and order after reports of multiple shootings within a protest zone in Seattle. Natalie Brand, CBS News, the White House.
Mustafa Tamiz joins me now. He's a former consultant for the Department of Homeland Security and an expert in the area of countering violent extremism. Mustafa, thanks very much for being with us. Last week, legislation addressing police reform stalled in the Senate. Are you optimistic that anything will get done with police reform at a national level?
Look, what we saw, although the legislation has been stalled, that the Senate actually started doing a police reform bill. For those of us like me that have been around for a long time, any kind of a police reform bill coming out of Senate would have been unheard of. So there is momentum. The House has passed it. There were 3 Republicans that also voted on the House bill. I think that there is, as street protests continue, and if they're peaceful, this is an election year. Some of the senators are feeling the pressure. And I think that I'm optimistic. Although sometimes when you look at the United States Congress, you would wonder if anything could get done. But I'm optimistic that this time, because of the protests and where we are in history, that there's an opportunity for some kind of reform.
I want to ask you, Mustafa, about something we're seeing in New York City. The NYPD says that more than 230 members have filed for retirement so far this month. That's nearly double compared to the same time last year. What do you think is behind that?
Well, look, I think a lot's being made of it. You know, the New York City Police Department is over 40,000 people. We've seen several hundred people that are closer to retirement ask for retirement earlier. There's a lot going on in our country. I think the bigger issue that I'm seeing, that although we're seeing the federal legislation stalled in the Senate, at the local level, at state level, that many of the police departments are starting to try to do some kind of reform. We see that right here in Houston with Mayor Turner and others that have tried to push forward reform within the police, and that's what's needed.
How much of a role do you think recruitment plays in all of this, and how do you think police recruitment should change?
Well, we've seen over the years, police recruitment has changed. Many of the police departments now require to have a 4-year degree. Many departments have higher standards. The House legislation was trying to create a national standard. This way, you know, there's a floor that's set up, and I think that's very important. But we've seen a lot of changes starting to take place. We've seen changes that have taken place over the years. But in order to have a cultural shift, we need to keep progress heading in the right direction, and we need more of it and for it to happen sooner.
Well, crime is spiking in some cities. New York City's homicide rate is at a 5-year high. Many backlogged courts are struggling with processing cases because of the pandemic. How do police departments respond to the public's demand to rewrite the rules of engagement while keeping streets safe?
One of the discussions that's come about that I think is critically important, that the solution to a rise in crime is not always more police. One of the solutions is to try to figure out what are the root causes. It's not just COVID-19, but our economy is going through a tremendous downturn. There's our employment right now is around 15 to 20% in many places. There's some that project unemployment might be 30%, and that's naturally going to have an impact on crime rates. We have to figure out, how do we get our young people the opportunities? How do we fix our education? How do we deal with our drug addiction issues? And as we begin to do that, that's a multifaceted way of tackling rising crime, rather than, when we see rising crime, just put more people in jail, which is what we've done in the past. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the street protests, because they're not just about equity in terms of socioeconomic equity, but equity also in terms of how people are treated.
Do you think it becomes more difficult to try to tackle some of those root problems, though, given that we are in the middle of a pandemic?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic, but on top of the pandemic, what we've got is an economic crisis, which I think is going to drive a lot of those crime rates. If you just look across the board, you're seeing, because of the pandemic, we've seen some increase in domestic violence. And two, with the rising of unemployment numbers, you're seeing, especially amongst the youth, that you're going to see some destruction in petty larcenies. And then overall, as a society, we're going to some real demographic changes. So you're seeing a lot of different things that add to the factor. And yes, it makes it complicated, but the opportunity is to fix it the right way, rather than just begin to put people in jail, which is what we've done in the past.
Mustafa Tamiz for us. Mustafa, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us.